Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Tim Palmer, and coming up today, emotions run deep in Parliament with the Prime Minister near tears. The extradition fight over Julian Assange heats up, and should employees be punished for gossiping? Our panel tonight, LJ Loch from communications company Republic, Stella from the Daily Grind, and ABC Online's Annabel Crabb in Canberra. Welcome all to The Drum today. Well, MPs have returned to Parliament for the first sitting day of the year, but instead of the usual heated question time debate, there were tributes and condolences for the victims of recent natural disasters. And after much public criticism for being too cool, Julia Gillard fought back tears as she recounted events of the Queensland floods.
The courage it takes for a young boy, 13-year-old Jordan Rice, to say to his rescuers, "Take my brother first." And before that brave rescuer could return, Jordan and Mum Donna were taken by the flood. But the legend of Jordan's amazing courage will go on. In a media report, Mark said, "I looked over my shoulder and I saw her sitting on the floor of the aircraft, and she was devastated. It was heartbreaking." What Mark was witnessing was a young pregnant mother who just seconds before the chopper had arrived had her young child wrenched from her weary arms by the flood waters.
Well, it was only on last night on Four Corners that we saw Julia Gillard asked about unflattering comparisons between Anna Bligh's response and perceptions of her own difficulty in relating to the public over the floods.
I don't let things like that worry me, and it's, sort of a sideline. What I judge myself by is whether I'm making the kind of difference that I want to make.
Well, Annabel Crabb, certainly they were touching stories that we heard the Prime Minister recount in Parliament, and everyone's searching for the real Julia. What did we see in the House today?
Well, we saw people talking about something pretty extraordinary and something really sad that happened not very long ago. And I've got to say I'm pretty uncomfortable with all of this instant analysis about what do the tears mean? What does it mean politically, You've got all these kind of tear specialists coming in, tear fall gauges. It's horrible, really, because, the whole point of putting the business of Parliament and the business of politics aside today is to actually take some time to commemorate, the people that were lost in those incidents, and I must say that I find even reading the stories about Jordan Rice, for instance, kind of impossible to read without welling up. And, it's hard to talk about as well, because that's just the most crushing story for, anyone who's got a family to hear, or anyone to hear. I just think now to be kind of progressing immediately to this political deconstruction of what it all means is kind of gross, because this is actually about, the real possibility about what's going on here is that maybe these are just really sad stories. And, Julia Gillard wasn't the only person to kind of well up a bit. Wayne Swan was certainly struggling today. I just feel like, maybe the last few weeks we've been arguing about money, where's this levy going and where's the savings going to come from? And I'm really anxious that this whole story doesn't get lost. Like, the real story here, what happened and how a day in Parliament can be devoted to recognising the loss of all sorts of people, doesn't get lost in making it all about Julia Gillard, which it isn't.
Yeah, well, the cost of, obviously, those lives and casualties up there. Julia Gillard did talk about the fact that, obviously, there have been comments that there have been a deficit in her response. LJ Loch, should we expect our politicians to emote on cue, or as Julia Gillard said last night on Four Corners, is it better that she achieve what she wants to achieve, having seen these awful incidents?
Well, just picking up on what Annabel said, today is a day of grieving. It's a day for us to grieve as a country for all of those stories of devastation and loss, not just as a result of the floods, but also, the SAS soldiers who were lost and the various devastation. I do think we have, as Annabel pointed out, become a little bit cynical in terms of saying she's turning it on for the cameras and politicians crying on cue. Let's give some credit where credit's due and acknowledge the grief that is happening out there in the community.
Stella, Tony Abbott made the comment that Julia Gillard clearly, through her response and in visiting victims, showed a decent heart, even if he disagreed with this other debate that's been going on for the past couple of weeks about how to finance infrastructure. That's a fairly generous political act at this stage, isn't it?
Well, I think we'll certainly find when we come around to the next Queensland election that the opposition will give credit where it's due to Anna Bligh in particular for her work during the floods. I think during a time of national disaster or great crisis, it's very difficult for the opposition because they're still putting out the case that they would have done it better, whatever it is. But ultimately, they've got to give credit where it's due, especially in a situation like this.
Annabel, can I ask, there were persistent cartoons for weeks suggesting that Julia Gillard had been diminished against Anna Bligh in Queensland.
Yep.
Do you think it's unfair? Is that what you're suggesting, to comment on public performance in that kind of fairly extreme emotional climate?
Yeah. Well, look, I think that we evaluate the way politicians do lots of things, and the way that they respond to crisis is pretty important because, it can have a big effect in the way information is got out to people who are in peril. If politicians are good communicators, and by the way, I think that was the great thing that Anna Bligh managed to accomplish during this period. It wasn't that she got the style right or that she got the vibe right. It's just that she kind of was really good at getting information out there fast, reliably, accurately, and in a way that people trusted and believed. And in the wind up to Cyclone Yassi, I think that was particularly the case. I think that the lack of casualties in that incident were a really good example of how communication systems can work really well. And look, Julia Gillard, because she travelled to the region, because she was standing next to Anna Bligh, was ceaselessly compared to her. I think in a crisis, as a politician, you are as useful as, you are as good as the use that you can be, and if you've got information to disseminate, then you're extremely useful. If you're kind of just standing around, it's very hard, to be of use to people who are in difficulties. I think that probably Julia Gillard suffered quite she would have been criticised for not going along. Then she was kind of criticised for her demeanour when she was there. I think that is all part and parcel of the difficulty that politicians often have handling disaster zones. Usually people aren't thinking about politics, and why would they be? If they're in danger, they're thinking about anything else. They just need information and they need services.
Well, aside from that discussion of the human cost today, there was a return to discussions about the actual physical cost of rebuilding in Queensland. The federal opposition is, of course, against the government's flood levy, and today it announced the budget savings it wants Labor to make instead of raising that levy. The biggest is $600 million deferring water buybacks in the Murray-Darling Basin, as expected. The opposition leader, Tony Abbott, and his shadow treasurer, Joe Hockey, also want to save $448 million by postponing a scheme building schools in Indonesia.
Indonesian schools program turns out to be something of high value. We're prepared to look at it again down the track. But with so many schools destroyed or damaged in Australia, we do think that charity begins at home.
Bear in mind, the government is spending $45 billion on interest repayments over the next 4 years alone because of government debt. $45 billion. And this argument about having, levies and setting up funds for ongoing disasters, that's what the budget is for.
Annabel Crabb, there was some dissent, supposedly, within the party about the idea of cutting foreign aid to Africa. There is a cut to foreign aid, only it's to Indonesia. What's the program that Tony Abbott wants to defer at this stage?
Well, the program in question, it's called the Australia-Indonesia Education Partnership. It was actually introduced in 2007. So it's kind of it was initiated by the previous government, but it was a much smaller project at that stage, worth about $11 million, I think, at that time. And the idea was to help build schools, English education and so on, as well as helping with Islamic schools in the Indonesian region. The idea is that you would actually nip in the bud any kind of extremist programs that were coming through those schools and support a neighbour in Indonesia in a constructive way. Now, what the Rudd government did early on in its term was to extend that program quite significantly. It's currently about a $445 million program. Not all the schools have been built yet. In fact, few of them have been built, so a lot of that money is still yet to be spent. Tony Abbott has said, well, look, you know, we actually want the efficacy of that scheme, the earlier, smaller scheme, to be part of the regional review of foreign aid. And until we work out whether that's going to be money well spent, we're going to defer it. So he said, and you could see in that grab, he said, well, look, if it turns out to be something worth keeping, then we'll reconsider it down the track. Now, a lot of the cuts that he announced today, which are about $2 billion worth, were a case of deferring funding rather than cutting it off summarily. So actually the savings occur over a few more years, whereas the levy that the government's proposing is all collected in 1 year. But what we have here is the opposition looking for areas in the budget that it can hold up as its response to the government's levy proposition. As Joe Hockey said today, we don't want to just be opposing the levy. We're going to lead by example, he says, and show you where we'd make the cuts.
Well, Joe, Stella, there's the alternative. Do you think that some of this sentiment expressed by people, including Barnaby Joyce, that charity begins at home has sort of been the feeling? That for some voters, they'd think, well, there's a program in Indonesia I didn't even know anything about. Well, if they can that and I don't have to pay their levy, there's some appeal there to voters?
Ultimately, politics has to be about priorities, and there's unlikely to be anything in the federal budget that's of no importance to anyone. And you see from the debate that's happened over the course of the past week or so, everyone's been pointing out things that they'd happily cut funding to or defer funding to, and then the interest groups who have backed each of those programs have come out and said, no, this is really important. Ultimately, leadership is about setting those priorities, and unfortunately, there are more important things for the government to do than building schools in Indonesia, for example.
It's quite clever politics from the opposition in terms of saying, particularly given the undecided nature of the independents, in terms of saying, we're not opposing it, let's just not do it now. So it actually is probably quite an interesting carrot to hold out to the independents in terms of saying, walk this way. Come towards us.
It's a difficult position to be in, because on the one hand, if they came out and they just said, oh, we're going to cut this, then they'd cop all of the political flack from the interest groups that back whatever it is that they cut. But they wouldn't get the political dividend for having paid for the flood reconstruction, because their plan wouldn't have gone through. Like, it's all downside. And I think there's a certain amount of courage in actually coming out and saying, here's a solution, here's a worked example.